to start us off into anatomy and physiology, I think it's important that we kind of take a look a little bit at what anatomy and physiology is, and also some of the overarching themes that you're going to see throughout this semester. So let's start by defining exactly what anatomy is. Anatomy is the study of body structure. And so this actually includes the physical relationship between the body parts. So it's not just the structures that are present, but also how they relate to each other, whether that is spatially, contained within one another, that sort of thing. And we have some specialties that are included as part of anatomy. The first major grouping of specialties fall under the category of gross anatomy. Gross anatomy means that things are fairly large, so these tend to be large parts that are visible to the eye. Gross anatomy includes things like surface anatomy, which includes our markings and our external features, as well as regional anatomy, where we focus specifically on a particular area like the head or the chest within the anatomical structures of the body. The other gross anatomy portion that we have is systemic anatomy, where you actually focus specifically on a body system. So some examples here of especially regional and systemic anatomy, some careers that actually kind of focus would be, with regional anatomy would be like an ears, nose, and throat specialist. They are focused specifically on a region within that. Whereas the systemic anatomy would be somebody like a gastroenterologist who is looking specifically at the gastrointestinal system or your digestive tract. Now those are our large features. We can also talk about the opposite versus big. We also can have small, and that would be microscopic anatomy. So these are small things that need magnification, usually in the form of a microscope. And that includes cytology, which is the study of cells. You can actually specialize in that. And histology, which is the study of tissues. So that is kind of anatomy and its specialties. So now let's look at physiology and its specialties. Physiology is the study of body functions. So you can see we've got kind of this pairing of the structure and the function when we're looking at anatomy and physiology. Now, anatomy is pretty easy to study. The parts are the parts, but physiology, quite honestly, is much more complex and difficult to examine. Simply because it's, in order to look at the functioning of certain areas of the body, it is very difficult to do without killing the organism. It's one of the reasons why we haven't quite figured out everything, in particular with, let's say, the human brain, simply because to try to study it while it's functioning is very, very, very difficult to do. Like anatomy, physiology has some specialties. And this includes things like human physiology, which is what we are going to be focusing on, cell physiology, in other words, the functioning of cells and how they work together, systemic physiology, in other words, again, taking that body system and the functioning of those body systems. And in addition, we also have a specialty which is called pathology. This is the study of different diseases within the physiological region, because when we typically have a disease, what is impacted is that system, that cell, that human is not functioning properly, and that's what diseases are. Now, the main overarching theme of this semester is this concept of homeostasis. And I know you've heard this term homeostasis from your biology time. So if you look at your paper, you actually have kind of this diagram here. We're going to add to this. This is meant to look, for instance, like a graph. So you've got your y-axis here and your x-axis here. If we were to monitor things on this graph, okay, different things in terms of homeostasis are actually represented here. The horizontal line on this graph, the x-axis, represents homeostasis. And what you have to keep in mind is homeostasis is our ideal state. Let me give you an example. For instance, humans have an ideal state for our body temperature, and that is 98.6. Now, however, if I were actually to look at my body temperature throughout the day, I would end up with a graph that doesn't run with a straight flat line. It would actually look something more like this. My temperature actually fluctuates based on my physical activity and the activities of the body that are being performed. My body temperature actually drops a little bit, for instance, when I'm digesting or resting, like I'm sleeping. And when I'm up and moving around, it actually raises slightly. Now, this graph is a little deceiving. What you have to understand is these fluctuations take place very tightly around that central ideal state of homeostasis. This fluctuation, though, is what we actually call dynamic equilibrium. And this is what we actually experience. So, as you can see, we don't hit homeostasis very often. We hit it here, and here, and here. So we do touch upon it, but we don't stay at homeostasis. This dynamic equilibrium, this reality, is regulated by our organ systems of the body. And again, what we're trying to do is keep this dynamic equilibrium as close to that level of homeostasis as possible. But sometimes what we will find is, let's say here, we come up and we go way out of homeostasis up here, or we come way down out of homeostasis down here. And this is a failure of our dynamic equilibrium or homeostasis. So what happens if this fails? And keep in mind, when we're talking about homeostasis, we're talking about the mechanisms that keep us in that tight dynamic equilibrium. If homeostasis fails, we actually run into a disease. That's what a disease is a failure of the organ systems to keep our body within our homeostatic levels. If we don't correct the situation, what we will find is the symptoms of the disease progress. And if homeostasis and the disturbance is not corrected, we can actually have organism death, which is obviously a bad outcome. So, how do we keep our bodies within the range of homeostasis? Okay. These ways that we do are called feedback mechanisms. Okay. And we have two types of feedback mechanisms in the body. The most common one that we use is called negative feedback. And in the next video about feedback and those feedback mechanisms, we will actually see that and what that is and how that works. This is the most common one that is used in humans. That doesn't mean that it's more important or less important. It just means that our bodies tend to use it more than others. The other type is called positive feedback. And it is less common. In fact, we only have two very specific situations in which we use positive feedback. But both of these mechanisms are important depending on the type and nature of the disturbance in homeostasis that occurs. So what we will be looking at in the next video is actually defining negative and positive feedback and actually going through the different mechanisms of these through a couple of examples.